Perhaps if you spent less time reading those romantic novels and more time learning proper deportment, dear Cordelia, you might finally catch a gentleman's attention. Though I fear even the most desperate bachelor would hesitate. The words dripped from Victoria's lips like poisoned honey as she adjusted her perfectly arranged golden curls in the grand mirror of the Ashworth mansion's morning room, her reflection gleaming with the confident beauty that had made her the toast of New York society. The sprawling estate overlooked the Hudson River, its Gothic Revival architecture commanding respect from every passing vessel, while its manicured gardens stretched endlessly toward the distant mountains like a testament to the family's unshakable prosperity. Within these walls, where crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across imported Italian marble and Persian rugs whispered beneath silk slippers, the three Ashworth sisters moved through their daily rituals with the precision of dancers in a ballet choreographed by society's most demanding expectations. Cordelia's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her leather-bound volume of poetry, her dark eyes remaining fixed upon the printed words that blurred slightly as Victoria's newest cruelty settled into her consciousness like another stone added to an already crushing weight. At 24, she had learned to absorb such remarks with the stoic grace of a woman who understood her place in the family hierarchy. Always third, always lacking, always the shadow cast by her sister's brilliant luminescence. Evangeline, the middle sister at 26, glanced up from her embroidery hoop, where delicate roses bloomed beneath her skillful needle, her expression carrying that peculiar mixture of sympathy and relief that came from witnessing cruelty directed at someone else. Victoria, really, she murmured with the gentle reproach of one who feared drawing attention to herself. There's no need to be quite so harsh, though her words carried all the conviction of morning mist before the sun. The morning light streaming through the towering windows illuminated the stark contrast between the sisters with almost cruel precision. Victoria's porcelain complexion and corn silk hair that seemed to capture and hold every ray of sunshine. Evangeline's soft brown curls and rosebud lips that painters begged to immortalize, and Cordelia's angular features that their father had once described, in a moment of thoughtless honesty, as distinguished rather than beautiful. Harsh? Victoria's laugh tinkled like the finest crystal, musical and sharp enough to cut. I'm merely offering sisterly guidance. After all, we cannot all be blessed with natural advantages. Her gaze swept meaningfully over Cordelia's tall, slender frame and serious countenance. But surely even the most challenging material can be improved with sufficient effort and realistic expectations. The servants moved through the room like ghosts, their trained invisibility a mercy that allowed the family's private cruelties to unfold without the burden of witnessed shame, though Cordelia sometimes caught the fleeting expressions of pity in their eyes, a kindness that somehow felt more devastating than her sister's calculated indifference. From the portrait gallery that lined the main corridor came the painted gazes of generations of Ashworth ancestors, their stern expressions seeming to weigh and measure each descendant's worthiness to carry the family name forward into an uncertain future. Cordelia had often wondered, during her solitary walks past these silent judges, whether any of them had ever felt like an unwelcome guest in their own bloodline. The social calendar spread before them like a battlefield map, each invitation representing another opportunity for Victoria and Evangeline to collect admirers, while Cordelia stood at the periphery of ballrooms, her intelligence and sharp wit somehow rendering her invisible to gentlemen who preferred their ladies decorative rather than thoughtful. The sound of carriage wheels upon gravel announced the arrival of yet another caller, sending Victoria into a flutter of mirror-checking, and Evangeline into a panic about her appearance, while Cordelia remained seated with her book, knowing with the certainty of long experience that no visitor had ever come seeking her company. Outside, the Hudson Valley sprawled in all its autumn glory, the maples and oaks painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that rivaled any European master's canvas. Yet even this natural splendor seemed to mock Cordelia's isolation, beauty surrounding her everywhere except within herself, according to the daily verdicts passed by those who should have loved her most. As her sisters primped and prepared for their perpetual performance of feminine perfection, Cordelia found herself wondering, not for the first time, whether love was truly the exclusive province of the beautiful, or whether somewhere in this vast world of careful manners and cruel hierarchies, there might exist a heart capable of seeing beyond the narrow confines of conventional charm. The brass nameplate on the calling card gleamed with foreign elegance. His Grace, Alessandro de Monteverde, Duke of Castellane. Though no amount of formal introduction could have prepared the Ashworth household for the man who stepped from his midnight black carriage with the fluid grace of predatory nobility. His presence seemed to alter the very atmosphere of their carefully ordered world, bringing with it the intoxicating scent of distant lands and dangerous possibilities. Victoria's calculated composure faltered for the first time in memory as she glimpsed him through the parlor window. Her usual arsenal of practiced smiles and rehearsed conversations suddenly feeling woefully inadequate against the aristocratic bearing of a man who carried centuries of European refinement in the set of his shoulders and the cool assessment of his storm-gray eyes. "He's here for Papa's banking connections, of course," Evangeline whispered, though her voice trembled slightly as she smoothed her already perfect skirts. "The Monteverde family controls half the shipping routes between here and the Mediterranean, and they're looking for American investments." Yet even as she spoke of practical matters, her hands betrayed her nervousness, fluttering like trapped birds against her throat. Cordelia felt the familiar sinking sensation of watching her sisters transform into their most radiant selves while she remained perpetually in shadow. Though something about the Duke's reputation preceded him, whispers of a man who had walked away from 3 engagement negotiations with Europe's most beautiful heiresses, leaving behind only polite regrets and broken hearts. The formal introduction unfolded in the blue drawing room with all the ceremony befitting such an illustrious guest. Victoria positioning herself to catch the best light, while Evangeline arranged herself with studied casualness beside the Steinway piano. Their father beaming with the satisfaction of a merchant prince entertaining European royalty. When the Duke's gaze finally settled upon Cordelia, she experienced the strangest sensation. Not the usual polite acknowledgement that preceded swift dismissal, but something far more unsettling. A recognition that seemed to pierce through every carefully constructed defense she had built around her bruised heart. His eyes lingered with an intensity that made her breath catch, as though he were reading some invisible text written across her soul. "Miss Cordelia," his voice carried the subtle music of his Italian heritage. "Your father tells me you're quite the scholar, a woman of genuine intellectual pursuits, rather than mere ornamental accomplishments." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shocked silence through her sister's perfect composure. Victoria's smile became so brittle it threatened to shatter. While Evangeline's confusion manifested in rapid blinking, neither sister quite comprehending why their guest would show such pointed interest in the family's acknowledged disappointment when 2 acknowledged beauties sat before him, like offerings on a silver tray. The afternoon tea proceeded with mounting tension, as the Duke continued to direct his most engaging remarks toward Cordelia, asking her opinions on literature and philosophy with the grave attention usually reserved for matters of state, while her sisters watched with growing incomprehension and barely concealed resentment. "I find," the Duke continued, his gaze never wavering from Cordelia's increasingly flushed face, "that true beauty lies not in symmetrical features, but in the complexity of thought behind intelligent eyes, something altogether rarer and more valuable than nature's common gifts." His words fell like benediction and curse combined, blessing Cordelia while delivering a devastating judgment upon everything her sisters had believed about their own worth. The careful choreography of the afternoon began to unravel, as Victoria's attempts to redirect conversation met with polite but firm resistance from their guest, who seemed genuinely fascinated by Cordelia's insights into Emerson's latest essays and her thoughtful critiques of the social reform movements sweeping through American society. When the Duke finally took his leave, bowing with particular reverence over Cordelia's gloved hand while offering only perfunctory courtesies to her sisters, the silence that followed his departure stretched like a taut wire about to snap, filled with implications too dangerous to voice yet too obvious to ignore. That evening, as Cordelia lay awake listening to the muffled sounds of her sister's urgent conference through the connecting wall, she found herself touching her hand where his lips had brushed her glove, wondering whether she dared believe that someone of his stature could truly see beyond the harsh verdicts that had shaped her understanding of her own worth since childhood. "You little fool." Victoria's voice cut through the morning air like a blade honed to perfect sharpness. "If you think for one moment that a duke, a real European aristocrat, could have any serious interest in you beyond temporary amusement, then you're even more pathetic than we imagined." The words struck Cordelia with the force of physical blows as she stood frozen in the conservatory, her morning book tumbling forgotten to the marble floor. Evangeline flanked her sister with the synchronized precision of practiced cruelty, her usual gentleness replaced by something far more vicious. The desperation of a woman who had watched her birthright of male attention stolen by the least deserving candidate. "He's playing some sort of sophisticated game," she added, her voice carrying wounded bewilderment. "Perhaps it's a European custom to mock American families by pretending interest in their spinster daughters." The glass walls of the conservatory seemed to close in around Cordelia, as her sisters circled her like beautiful predators, their morning gowns rustling with barely contained fury, while exotic orchids bloomed obliviously around them in a mockery of natural beauty that suddenly felt as artificial as everything else in her world. "Look at yourself," Victoria commanded, seizing Cordelia's chin with manicured fingers and forcing her to face her reflection in the conservatory's mirrored panels. "Truly look. Those angular cheekbones that could cut glass, that stubborn jaw, those eyes that are too intelligent for any man's comfort. What could a duke possibly want with such merchandise when he could have anyone?" The accumulated weight of 24 years of similar assessments came crashing down upon Cordelia's shoulders as she stared at the reflection her sister held before her. The face that had never launched ships or inspired poetry, that had failed to attract even the most desperate fortune hunters among their social circle, that had somehow earned the focused attention of European nobility. "You've been reading too many of those ridiculous novels." Evangeline's voice carried the poisonous sweetness of infected honey, filling your head with fantasies about intelligent women being valued for their minds while ignoring the basic facts of nature. Men want beauty, grace, feminine softness, all the qualities you've never possessed and never will. The morning light streaming through the greenhouse glass seemed to take on a harsh quality, illuminating every flaw that Cordelia had learned to hide, every imperfection that her sisters had catalogued and memorized for moments precisely like this, when her spirit dared to lift itself above its proper station. "He's probably gathering material for amusing stories to share with his European friends," Victoria continued relentlessly. "Can you imagine the amusing colonial spinster who actually believed a duke might court her? What delicious entertainment for sophisticated society." Her laughter rang through the conservatory like breaking crystal, sharp enough to draw blood. The exotic blooms around them, orchids and jasmine and rare roses that their father imported at enormous expense, seemed to mock Cordelia's position with their effortless beauty, their ability to command admiration through mere existence while she struggled and failed to earn even basic human kindness from her own flesh and blood. "Do you know what the servants whisper?" Evangeline leaned closer, her breath warm against Cordelia's ear like poisonous intimacy. "They feel sorry for you. Imagine being so pathetic that even the staff pities your delusions. They watch you moon over that calling card he left and shake their heads at the tragedy of unrequited hope." The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of Cordelia's thundering heart as realization crashed over her in waves. Every kindness she had ever received had been tainted with pity. Every conversation had been charity extended to the unfortunate. Every moment of attention had been purchased with the currency of sympathy rather than earned through worth. "We're trying to save you from humiliation." Victoria's voice softened to counterfeit compassion. "Imagine the scandal when he fails to call again, when society realizes that even our charity case sister believed herself worthy of ducal attention. The family name would never recover from such presumption." The book that had fallen from Cordelia's nerveless fingers lay open to a page of poetry about love transcending physical beauty, its optimistic verses now seeming like cruel jokes, written by authors who had never lived within a woman's skin that failed to meet the world's exacting standards for feminine worth. Despite her sister's devastating counsel and the careful barriers Cordelia had rebuilt around her battered heart, the Duke returned with the persistence of ocean waves against stone. each visit wearing away another layer of her carefully constructed defenses, while her family watched with mounting alarm and barely concealed hostility. His calling card appeared with clockwork regularity on the silver tray in their foyer, accompanied by books of Italian poetry, rare botanical specimens for their conservatory, and invitations to cultural events that seemed specifically designed to appeal to Cordelia's intellectual interests, while pointedly excluding her sisters from their cultivated conversations. "This has gone quite far enough," their father declared during a tense family dinner, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his domestic empire. "The Duke's interest in your sister is becoming the subject of society gossip, and not the favorable kind." His words fell across the mahogany table like a judicial sentence, heavy with implications that made Cordelia's silverware suddenly feel impossibly weighty in her trembling hands. Victoria's satisfaction at this paternal intervention radiated from her like heat from a furnace, her smile sharp enough to cut crystal as she delicately carved her roasted quail with the precision of a surgeon performing a vital operation. "Finally," she murmured, just loudly enough for Cordelia to hear. "Someone with sense addresses this embarrassing charade before it destroys what little reputation our family retains." The Duke's latest invitation, a private viewing of rare manuscripts at the Metropolitan Museum, lay beside Cordelia's plate like an unexploded bomb, its elegant script seeming to mock the growing tension that had transformed their once peaceful household into a battlefield where every glance carried the weight of unspoken accusations. "He's making us all look ridiculous," Evangeline added, her usual gentleness replaced by the sharp edge of desperation. "Society is beginning to whisper that the famous Ashworth beauties must be lacking something essential if a duke prefers their plain sister's company." Her words carried the wounded pride of a woman who had built her entire identity upon being universally desired. The conversation died as their butler announced the Duke's unexpected arrival, sending Victoria and Evangeline into panicked attempts to improve their appearances, while Cordelia felt her heart perform impossible acrobatics against her ribs, torn between terror and a dangerous blooming hope that refused to be entirely extinguished. When Alessandro entered their dining room, his presence seemed to shift the very air, his storm-gray eyes seeking Cordelia's face with an intensity that made her father clear his throat meaningfully, and her sisters exchange glances laden with murderous intent. "Forgive the intrusion." His voice carried musical authority. "But I couldn't wait until proper calling hours to extend an invitation that I hope Miss Cordelia will find irresistible." The Duke's proposal for a chaperoned carriage ride through Central Park the following afternoon fell into the room like a gauntlet thrown down before assembled enemies, challenging everything her family believed about proper social order and the natural hierarchy of feminine attractiveness that had governed their world since memory began. "How thoughtful," their father responded with the diplomatic smile of a man walking across thin ice. "Though I fear Cordelia's social calendar is rather full these days. So many charitable obligations, you understand, for young ladies of her particular temperament." The pause before his final words carried enough weight to sink ships. Cordelia felt the familiar sensation of becoming invisible, even while occupying the center of attention, her own voice trapped behind years of conditioning that had taught her to accept others' judgments about her worth, her prospects, her right to pursue happiness beyond the narrow confines assigned to unwanted daughters. The Duke's gaze never wavered from her face as he awaited her response, his expression carrying patient determination that suggested he would wait indefinitely for her answer, while around them, the family held its collective breath like spectators at a public execution. When she finally found courage to whisper, "Yes," the word barely audible above the sound of her sister's indrawn breath, the Duke's smile transformed his aristocratic features into something approaching genuine warmth, while her family's faces settled into expressions of barely controlled fury that promised swift and devastating retribution. The ultimatum arrived at breakfast with the morning correspondence, delivered in their father's most authoritative tone as Cordelia sat surrounded by the remnants of what had once been familial affection, now curdled into something unrecognizable and poisonous. "You will decline his invitation," he announced, his words falling like the closing of a tomb, "and any future correspondence from the Duke will be returned unopened." Victoria's triumph radiated from her like perfume as she buttered her toast with movements that somehow managed to convey vindictive satisfaction, while Evangeline nodded approvingly, though her eyes held something that might have been regret, buried beneath layers of self-preservation and competitive desperation. The walls of the breakfast room seemed to press closer around Cordelia as she realized that this moment would define the remainder of her existence, submit to her family's verdict, and accept the slow death of perpetual spinsterhood, or risk everything for the possibility that someone of worth might truly value what she had to offer. "If you persist in this foolishness," her father continued, his voice carrying the cold finality of financial ruin, "you will find yourself without family, without home, without the social connections that make existence bearable for a woman of your limitations." Each word was calculated to remind her of her complete dependence upon their charity and goodwill. The Duke's invitation lay before her like a doorway to another world, its elegant script seeming to pulse with possibility, even as her family's collective disapproval threatened to suffocate any remaining courage she might possess. Through the tall windows, she could see carriages passing on their tree-lined avenue, carrying people toward destinations she could barely imagine. "He'll abandon you within a fortnight." Victoria's voice carried the certainty of prophecy. "And then where will you be? Too proud to return home, too damaged for any respectable man to consider, too poor to maintain yourself independently. You'll end your days as some wealthy family's governess, if you're fortunate enough to find even such degraded employment." The weight of 24 years of accumulated doubts pressed down upon Cordelia's shoulders as she stared at her reflection in the silver coffee pot, seeing again the angular features and serious expression that had failed to inspire devotion in any man save one. And perhaps even his interest was merely sophisticated cruelty disguised as attention. Evangeline leaned forward with counterfeit sympathy, her voice dripping with poisonous kindness as she delivered what was meant to be the final blow. "Even if his interest is genuine now, what happens when he introduces you to European society? Imagine standing beside Italian contessas and French duchesses, women bred for beauty and grace from birth. How long before he realizes his mistake?" The silence stretched like a taut wire as 3 pairs of eyes fixed upon Cordelia with the intensity of judges awaiting a verdict. While she felt the last fragments of her former self crumbling away to reveal something harder and more desperate beneath, a woman with nothing left to lose except the possibility of discovering her own worth. The memory of the Duke's storm-gray eyes rose in her mind like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman, the way he had looked at her as though she were a rare manuscript worthy of careful study and deep appreciation, rather than a charitable case requiring patient tolerance from her social betters. When she finally spoke, her voice emerged from some previously undiscovered reservoir of strength, steady and clear, despite the earthquake of terror beneath her ribs. "I will accept his invitation," she said, watching her family's faces transform into masks of shocked fury. "And whatever consequences follow will be mine to bear." The breakfast room erupted into chaos, as her father rose from his chair with the authority of an absolute monarch whose word had been challenged, while her sisters stared at her as though she had just announced her intention to join a circus or become a courtesan, their beautiful faces twisted with disbelief and rage that bordered on religious fervor. The locked door of her bedroom became both prison and sanctuary, as Cordelia found herself confined to quarters, while her family debated her fate in urgent conferences that echoed through the mansion's halls, like the distant rumble of approaching storms. Through her window, she could see the Duke's carriage waiting punctually at their gate, his driver checking his pocket watch with the patience of a man accustomed to important people keeping their own schedules. Her maid Sarah appeared with breakfast on a silver tray, and tears in her eyes, having witnessed the family's fury when Cordelia failed to appear at the appointed hour for her rejection of the Duke's invitation. "They're saying terrible things, miss," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. "About sending you away to your aunt in Philadelphia where no one knows you." The prospect of exile hung over the room like incense, heavy with the promise of social death and permanent separation from everything familiar. yet somehow carrying within it the seed of liberation from the endless cycle of judgment and disappointment that had defined her existence within these walls. Below in the garden, she could see Victoria, pacing among the rose bushes with the agitated energy of a woman whose worldview had been fundamentally challenged, while Evangeline sat motionless on the marble bench like a beautiful statue, carved from disappointed hopes and wounded vanity. When the Duke's second carriage arrived bearing an enormous bouquet of rare orchids and a leather-bound volume of Dante's works with passages marked in his elegant hand, Cordelia felt something crystallize within her chest, the recognition that she stood at the fulcrum between two entirely different versions of her life, and that choosing safety would mean accepting slow suffocation disguised as familial protection. The sound of raised voices drifted up from the library where her father conducted increasingly heated discussions with business associates about the potential damage to their reputation if their youngest daughter persisted in this incomprehensible rebellion against natural order, his words carrying the weight of a man who had built an empire through careful control of every variable. Sarah returned with hushed news that the Duke had been seen making inquiries about respectable boarding houses in the city, suggesting preparations for possibilities that made Cordelia's heart race with terror and anticipation in equal measure. The prospect of survival beyond her family's sphere of influence seemed as impossible and necessary as breathing underwater. The afternoon stretched endlessly as servants moved through the corridors with the careful silence of people navigating a battlefield, their usual cheerful efficiency replaced by the tense awareness that they were witnessing the dissolution of the family structure that governed their own security and purpose. When darkness finally fell, bringing with it the blessed privacy of night, Cordelia made her decision with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute desperation. She would attend the governor's reception, where she knew the Duke would be present, and there she would either find the courage to claim her right to happiness or accept her fate as a woman too strange for her own family to understand or shelter. The bag she packed contained only essentials, and the pearl necklace her grandmother had left specifically to her. Its modest value perhaps enough to sustain her for a few weeks, while she discovered whether the strength she felt growing within her chest was real or merely the hysteria of a woman driven to madness by impossible circumstances. Her reflection in the darkened window showed a face transformed by determination into something almost beautiful, not the conventional beauty her sisters possessed, but the stark elegance of a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in a world that seemed determined to deny her existence. The note she left on her pillow was brief and dignified, expressing gratitude for the shelter her family had provided while making clear that she could no longer accept love offered on the condition of her own diminishment, and that she chose uncertainty over the certainty of gradual spiritual death. As she descended the servants' staircase with the stealth of a practiced exile, Cordelia felt the weight of her former life falling away, like chains she had worn so long they had become invisible, replaced by the terrifying lightness of a woman with nothing left to lose except the possibility of discovering who she might become when freed from others' definitions of her worth. The governor's mansion blazed with gaslight and crystal as New York society gathered in its finest silk and jewels, unaware that among them moved a woman who had crossed an invisible bridge between two versions of herself, no longer the charitable case of the Ashworth family, but something far more dangerous. A person with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from honest truth. When Cordelia appeared in the ballroom doorway, wearing her grandmother's emerald silk gown and carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had survived her own family's attempt to destroy her spirit, the Duke's face transformed with a recognition that transcended mere social politeness and approached something very like wonder. "Miss Ashworth," he said, as he approached her with the focused determination of a man who had been waiting his entire life for this particular moment. "You look like a woman who has finally decided to stop hiding from her own magnificence." His words carried the weight of benediction as he offered his arm with the reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. The ballroom fell away around them as they moved together through the elaborate figures of the waltz, while behind them, Cordelia could see her sisters' faces, frozen in expressions of shocked disbelief that their discarded daughter had somehow transformed herself into exactly the kind of woman who belonged at a duke's side. "I must confess," Alessandro murmured as they turned beneath the glittering chandeliers. "That I've been enchanted since our first meeting by your complete immunity to your own extraordinary qualities. Intelligence paired with compassion, strength tempered by gentleness, beauty that grows more remarkable the longer one observes it." His words fell like rain on drought-parched earth. The revelation that followed unfolded like the petals of a night-blooming flower as he explained his long search for a woman who could be a true partner rather than merely a beautiful ornament. Someone capable of understanding the complexities of managing vast estates and international business interests while bringing genuine warmth to the cold grandeur of ancestral palaces. "My grandmother was considered plain by her generation's standards," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of family history and personal revelation. "Yet she was the strongest woman I ever knew. Brilliant enough to multiply our family's fortune threefold, and compassionate enough to be beloved by every person who served our household. I've been looking for her equal in spirit, if not in blood." The night air on the mansion's terrace carried the scent of late-blooming roses as they escaped the ballroom's overwhelming luxury for the blessed privacy of starlight and honest conversation, where Cordelia finally found courage to voice the fears that had haunted her since childhood, that perhaps she truly was unmarriageable, too strange and angular for love's gentle territories. His laughter was warm enough to melt the accumulated ice around her heart as he gathered her hands in his and spoke of the Italian proverb that real beauty reveals itself slowly, like wine aging in ancient cellars, growing richer and more complex with time, rather than fading like the superficial bloom that society mistakes for lasting value. "Your sisters are undoubtedly lovely," he said, with the diplomatic courtesy of a man trained in international negotiation. "But they are like beautiful paintings, pleasant to observe, but offering nothing beyond surface appreciation. You are like a masterpiece that rewards study, revealing new layers of complexity and meaning each time one returns to examine it." The proposal that followed was unlike any fairy tale Cordelia had ever read, delivered not with theatrical romance, but with the quiet sincerity of a businessman presenting a partnership agreement that happened to include profound mutual affection and the promise of building something magnificent together across continents and decades. When they returned to the ballroom to announce their engagement, the transformation in society's perception was instantaneous and complete. Suddenly, Cordelia found herself surrounded by people eager to discover what hidden qualities had captured ducal attention. Her intelligence reframed as fascinating rather than frightening, her independence celebrated rather than criticized. The final confrontation with her family unfolded in the Duke's presence with the swift justice of fairy tales. As her father's attempts to reclaim authority over her future met with the polite but inflexible resistance of a man accustomed to moving mountains when they stood between him and his objectives, while her sisters watched in stunned silence as their discarded sibling ascended to heights they could never reach. In the months that followed, as wedding preparations transformed her from Cordelia Ashworth into the Duchess of Castellane, she discovered that love had never been about earning worthiness through conformity, but about finding someone capable of recognizing the magnificence that had always existed beneath the surface, waiting for the right eyes to see and celebrate its unique brilliance. The woman who sailed for Italy with her Duke carried within her heart the revolutionary truth that redemption comes not from changing oneself to meet others' expectations, but from finding the courage to insist that one's authentic self deserves both recognition and love, and that such courage, once discovered, transforms not only individual destiny, but the very definition of what makes a life worth living. If this tale of unexpected love and hard-won recognition moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more stories of hearts finding their true home despite impossible odds.